We're talking about Maimonides' ethics today, and I think we'll concentrate on that. There are a couple of other things in that section. If we have time, we'll get into them, like the purpose of life and the kind of interesting things that he says about relativism. I hope we'll have time to do that too, but I wanted to give you the main content of his ethics, because what he does with ethics is very, very interesting. When I was in college, they taught us that there are two kinds of ethical theory. There's ethics, come on in. There's ethics that is called consequentialist. And that's the ethics that worries about what are the outcomes of your actions. If you think that an action is good because it produces the most pleasure and bad because it produces the most pain, that's a consequentialist view. The other kind of ethics has a fancy name. It's called deontological, and that's the ethics of don't worry about the consequence, worry about the intentions, worry about whether it's right. Actions can be right or wrong in and of themselves. Those are the two kinds of ethics. And an interesting thing happened. As time went on, people got more and more interested in a classical kind of way of doing ethics that was so unpopular when I was a kid in college that they didn't even list it as one of the, there were only these two main types. It's called virtue ethics. And it was developed in great detail by Aristotle. And virtue ethics is based not on consequences and not on intentions, although it takes account of both of those, but it's based on what kind of person do you want to be? Do you want to be a good person? Do you want to be a strong person? Do you want to be a thoughtful person, a generous person? Do you want to be a nasty person, a mean and irascible person, a jealous person? There are various kinds of psychological tendencies that can grow inside of us and that we ourselves can encourage, that we can encourage in our children, that we can encourage in ourselves. These are called virtues and vices. And that idea, that way of looking at ethics, was so unpopular when I was a kid in college that even the words virtue and vice were considered no-nos. They thought that virtue had only to do with female chastity, and vice was something that a certain branch of the police department was concerned with. And they didn't really get the point. But, well, an old philosopher told me when he was in his 90s, he said, every once in a while people say philosophy is over. It's over and done with. From now on we're going to do fiction, we're going to do letter writing, we're going to do conversation. And then somebody comes along and reads Aristotle, and it gets started all over again. And that is exactly what happened. Somebody came along and read Aristotle, a couple people did actually, and they noticed that Aristotle had a completely different way of doing ethics that was based on this question of character. Character in Greek, by the way, is ethos, E-T-H-O-S. It could be an individual character, it could be the character of a whole community. And that's going to be important for Maimonides, because he's very interested in this question of the formation of character. And when Maimonides reads the Torah, he reads it with the eyes of someone who is deeply versed in Aristotle. He's one of those people who has come along and who has gotten a philosophical education, in this case in ethics, by reading Aristotle. And he has read the Torah against the background of a lot of people who think that the only purpose of all the commandments of the Torah is that God said you have to do it, so you have to do it. And that was not just a common view in his time, it's a common view in our own time. Some people who believe in the Torah think that that's what the Torah says, and some people who are very critical of it think that that's what the Torah says. And they say, you see, it just says, thou shalt do this, thou shalt not do that, do this, don't do that, in this very arbitrary and dogmatic and dictatorial and imperious kind of way. And it never gives a reason. Now, that's going a little too far, isn't it? There are some of the things that it says in the Torah that actually do give reasons. And if you look very closely and very thoughtfully at the Torah, one of the interesting places where reasons are given is in Leviticus chapter 19, Kedoshim, right? Chapter 19, verse 2, it says, you shall be holy, for I, the Lord thy God, am holy. And then it goes ahead and it gives a bunch of other commandments some of which have to do with sexual relations, and some of which have to do with what you can eat, and some of which are very ethical commandments about relationships with our fellow human beings, like love thy neighbor as thyself. Just a few verses further on. It's in the context of telling people you shouldn't hold a grudge, you shouldn't exact vengeance, you shouldn't refrain from rebuking or reproving somebody who's done something wrong. You should take them aside and tell them. All right? These are ethical commandments. They're commandments that have to do with how we ought to relate to one another, and they're thematized by that larger commandment, which in a way gives the reason for all the rest. These are ways of being holy. Sometimes by refraining from eating certain things, sometimes refraining from certain kinds, it may be attractive, but certain sexual relations we refrain from. These are ways of being holy. And sometimes it has to do with the way we treat our fellow human beings, relating to them in a considerate way, putting yourself in the other person's shoes. This is a way of being holy. This is a way of actually emulating God. Maimonides is very interested in the fact that the biblical laws all do have reasons. And he argues against people who think that they're just positive laws. Positive means just commands without any reason. He says, if you think that about divine laws, then you're saying, in effect, that God just, does things pointlessly. After all, God doesn't benefit from our obeying his commands. God doesn't need anything from us. These things are designed to help us. To help us how? Well, to make us a certain kind of people, to help us develop a certain kind of character. One of the examples, I've mentioned it before, but I'll mention it again because it's so telling. In the Torah, there's a commandment, right in the same area with the same sort of theme going on. There's a commandment that if you're going down the road and you see your enemy and his ass has fallen down in the road, and the load is spilled all over the place, there's a biblical command that you're supposed to stop and help him load it up again. And I remember I said this before because I said for ass read pickup truck. All right? But the important thing is that it mentions the enemy. You might think that it could say just anybody. Why not, a stranger, anybody? Why spell it out? Why pointedly remark that this is a commandment to help your enemy when he's in trouble? Because it's obvious you could generalize on the kind of trouble that he could be, and you could also generalize on the kind of person it could be. But why spell out the enemy? Maimonides says, because the purpose of the law is to help us to become a certain kind of character. What kind of character? Well, less irascible. Less irascible. There's a natural human tendency to irascibility. It's not the only tendency. There are other tendencies too. We have tendencies to be nice, but you want to cultivate certain tendencies, and you want to control and quell and modify other tendencies. And the effect, he says, psychologically, of going down the road and actually getting involved in helping this person, you didn't like him before, but there you are working together, it's not just to win him over with kindness. It's not to kill him with kindness. It's to do something to yourself, to make yourself a different kind of person than you have been in the past. That's in philosophy they like to say a paradigm case. That's an example of the way Maimonides reads the law in order to get big themes out of little examples. Because remember, the Torah doesn't use a lot of abstract language. So it takes this very concrete situation, which anybody can picture and put himself or herself into, and it gives you an idea of what kind of person you want to be. That's the way he sets about writing his ethical work. Now, I took the passage in my book about the ethics from a little work called The 8 Chapters. We got plenty of room. We got lots more chairs. Don't be shy, folks. Please come in. It's a little work called The 8 Chapters. It's often published and studied separately, but it comes from an interesting context. It comes from Maimonides' commentary on the Mishnah. The Mishnah is the code of Jewish law. It's the skeleton and backbone of the Talmud. The rest is commentary. And in the Mishnah, most of the tractates, all of the tractates of the Mishnah but one, have this extensive commentary which takes a little chapter and turns it into a great big folio volume. Okay? But this one chapter, the Mishnah Avot, the sayings of the fathers, right, which we also study sometimes, right, that doesn't have any Gemara on it. It doesn't have the extensive commentary. It just consists of a collection of remarks. He quotes a few in the course of his discussion of it. Remarks like, famous remarks like, if I am not for myself, who will be? Which, yeah, that's right. It quotes these from famous rabbis in order to give you the flavor of their ethical teaching. So it's sometimes called the ethics of the fathers. And because this is a place where ethical doctrines are dealt with, Maimonides takes advantage of that in his commentary, and he writes a more systematic little work as an introduction to it. That's the 8 chapters. He also wrote a commentary on the sayings of the fathers, but he writes an introduction to it in which he lays out what he thinks are the very basic schematics of ethics. He starts out with psychology because he thinks that ethics is really about character. And in order to understand what the strengths and weaknesses of character are, you have to know how the human psyche works. So that's very much in keeping with his idea that biblical law is attuned to human needs, right? It's not just something in the abstract. It's not just something arbitrary. So he sets out the basic faculty psychology. Faculties are different capabilities that humans have, which was pretty conventional in his time. We have, they used to say, a vegetative soul, an animal soul, and a rational soul. The vegetative soul he calls nutritive, and that involves functions like growth, reproduction, digestion. You've seen them listed in the book, those of you who are reading the book. He calls what they traditionally call the animal soul, he calls that the irritable soul or something like that, the one that's responsive, the sensitive soul. The third faculty that he deals with is what's called representation. Representation could also be translated imagination, but I think I've mentioned to you already that representation in classical and medieval psychology imagination in classical and medieval psychology doesn't mean what it means in modern thinking. In modern thinking, imagination means creativity. But in those days, it meant just the ability to put together a kind of sensory replica of what you've perceived, what you've seen, what you've heard, to remember a melody after you've heard it, to remember a face, to rearrange and imagine what would so-and-so look like with long hair, all right? That kind of thing. You can restructure, and you can see how it comes to mean creativity there because of the rearranging of the parts of the picture. It's not just a visible picture. It could be an auditory picture, or it could be an olfactory picture. It could be part of your sense of smell, as somebody could do who remembers a scent or a flavor or a texture, or a perfume designer who imagines what it would be to combine two different scents and have this particular one. Okay? The fourth faculty that he deals with, the first was nutritive, the second was sensitive, the third is representational, the fourth is arousal. And this has to do with like and dislike, pursuit and avoidance. That's going to be important for ethics. That's going to be the key one for ethics because that has to do with making choices. And the fifth one is the rational. Now, two things you need to know about the rational, and this in Maimonides is typical of what people thought about psychology in his time. Reason in Maimonides and in most psychologists of his time doesn't just calculate, it doesn't just make logical deductions, it actually is involved in speculation, and understanding, and that's its theoretical role, and it also has a practical role. It makes value judgments. And the difference between reason and arousal is that reason makes value judgments about what's really good and what's really bad, as opposed to arousal, which might take something to be good. That's that animal level again, you see. Or take something to be bad but get it wrong. Okay? Because that's a more of an automatic kind of response. As you might, somebody comes through with, the sizzling platter, and you start to salivate. That's arousal. Not necessarily stuff that's good for you, though. Not necessarily stuff that belongs to you. You can make value judgments about, it smells good, but actually the waiter was bringing it to somebody else's table. All right? Reason can make that distinction. Arousal doesn't make such fine distinctions. Okay? There's one other thing that reason does in his faculty of psychology. Remember, it doesn't just calculate, it doesn't just do deductions. It understands, and it makes value judgments accurately. But actually, he says, if you want to understand the role of reason in human psychology, picture the soul as a kind of mass of matter. The soul is kind of a living principle which needs to be organized. Reason is what organizes it. Reason is what directs it and tells it where to go and how to go. And without that, it would just be a big blob and go all over the place. He makes the point, by the way, and this is why he doesn't use the word animal and vegetative soul. He makes the point that all the things he's talking about are human. So human senses are distinctively human. Human appetites and aversions are distinctively human. It's analogous to what a dog or a cat would have, but it's not the same. We have our own tastes, we have our own perceptions, we have our own way of seeing things. Think about the fact that there are sounds that your dog can hear that you can't hear. And you'll see that the sensibilities are different right away. So are the appetites, right? They can make these gourmet doggy biscuits, but we wouldn't necessarily like them. All right? He picks up an idea from the ancient philosophers, and if you read him very carefully, you'll notice he gives credit right at the beginning. He says he's getting his ideas. He says the ideas that he's putting forward are not original. He's getting them from the Torah, and he's getting them from the ancient philosophers. Why does he say that? Well, he's getting them from the Torah because he's going to use the ideas of the ancient philosophers to bring out the thematics of the Torah and to show you what the big conceptual issues are, what the big themes, what the big questions, what the big concerns behind all these laws really are. He wants to give credit to those philosophers who organized that material. But what he's going to take from the Torah is the particular tone, the particular theme, the particular tenor that these laws will give you to develop a certain kind of character in an individual or in a community. The theme he picks up from the ancient philosophers here is the idea of the treatment of the soul. It's a very old idea. It's an idea that Socrates had. Socrates used to hang out in gyms and wrestling places and places where people worked out. And he said, you've got a doctor and you've got a dietitian and you've got people who are trainers who are showing you how to work out. They had all that stuff in the 4th century BC. But he says, the treatment of the soul is even more important than the treatment of the body. And you need to exercise and you need to condition your mind and your heart and your outlook, and not just your body. That idea of the treatment of the soul, you could call it psychotherapy, but we think of, that's what treatment of the soul means, right? But we think of psychotherapy as dealing with people who are off their rocker, or who are neurotic, or who are borderline. Socrates makes the point, and you can see him making this point in that gymnasium context where he used to hang out, right? You don't go to the trainer only when you're sick. You go to the trainer to stay in. It's wellness rather than health, right? It's not just healing. It's wellness. And there's a kind of psychological wellness too. That has to do with improving your character, not just with treating it when it's sick. Maimonides here is writing as a physician, but he's writing as a kind of analogy with his physical practice into a kind of psychological practice as well. The commandments of the Torah, he says, are addressed to the treatment of the soul, and particularly to the sensitive and arousal aspects of the soul. Why? Well, because we don't really control the nutritive or the imaginative. How do you know that? Because they work even when you're sleeping. And that's a principle of Jewish law, right? Obviously, we don't control our own digestion. It goes on when we're sleeping or when we're waking. It doesn't make any difference. And we're not responsible, according to Jewish law, for what we might dream, right? Imagination works even when you're sleeping. We're not responsible for what we see, but we are responsible for what we do about it. When we get attracted to something or repelled by something, then you get into an area where you've got decisions to make. And that's where reason is going to acquire some responsibility. And that's where law, moral law, becomes very relevant. Let me tell you about virtues and vices. Here he's building on what Aristotle did. Virtues and vices are strengths and weaknesses of character. If you want to know what's a virtue or what's a vice, there's no big mystery about it. You just have to think about what would make me effective at being what I ought to be, at doing what I ought to do. A virtue, here's a good paradigm case for you. A virtue is a kind of characteristic that you wish the guy next to you in the foxhole had, okay? And that he wishes you had. The kind of person you could rely on, the kind of person you could trust, the kind of person you would give your photograph of your sweetheart to take home to her parents if something happened to you. Somebody you could rely on. Somebody who's going to make good judgments about how to do things the right way. Those are virtues. The basic framework in which Aristotle thinks this is the assumption that everybody has a certain role to play, everybody has certain ends to pursue. There are certain things that all of us have in common and that make it possible for us to live with one another and to relate to one another and to get along with one another and to make a community. And those characteristics that make you more effective at your role are virtues. And those that make you less effective at your role are vices. They're weaknesses. Strengths and weaknesses of character. If you've got a clear idea of what your objectives as a human being are, and that's going to be very important for Maimonides to define what that is. If you've got a clear idea of what your objectives as a human being are, then it becomes pretty easy by looking at examples of peers and parents and role models and looking at your own past performance and looking at literature and past experience and history. It becomes pretty easy to see what would really function as a strength and what would really function as a weakness in a human character. Somebody who tells lies habitually, for example. Right? That's not in general a strength of character. There are situations where you might have to lie, but a person who habitually lies, that's not a strong character. Kind of example that Aristotle likes to give, I'll give you one. Courage. The virtues are thought of as lying in a mean. And that, again, is because of the medical analogy. There's too much and there's too little, with medicine, with exercise, with diet. A mean means a middle ground. A golden mean. A golden mean. Okay. The phrase golden mean comes from Horace, aurea mediocritas, not from Aristotle. But the concept is very older than Aristotle. But Aristotle does an interesting thing with it. He takes this sort of commonsensical and medical idea of the middle ground or the mean, and he refines it in a certain way. Here's what the mean means in ethics. Think about situations where you're facing something that the arousal factor in you might take to be good or bad. We'll call that a prima facie good. It's good on the face of it, or bad on the face of it. All right? In the case of courage, we're dealing with a prima facie evil, namely danger. Why do I say a prima facie evil? Well, because whether danger is really bad or not depends on the circumstances. If there's a child and the house is burning down, it might be necessary to get in there. The danger is a prima facie evil, but it's outweighed by another prima facie good, saving the child. Okay? We've got to consider the circumstances, the risk. What are my skills? What's my likelihood of saving the child? You've got all kinds of things to consider in a situation like this. There are two wrong ways to handle this situation. There's a whole range of wrong ways on either side of the middle. There's the person who habitually runs away from danger, who can't face danger, who mechanically, reflexively avoids it. And that person has a vice, which is cowardice. A person who is too timid is a coward. There are no circumstances in which that person would regard any degree of danger as acceptable, no matter what. Notice, please, that that's a mechanical kind of response, not thoughtful. Reason is not in charge there. The other alternative, and there's a whole range of that. You could be more timid or less timid, or more cowardly or less cowardly, right? The other extreme is equally mechanical, but going in the other direction. A person who seeks danger, who pursues risk for its own sake. What's such a person called? Rash, foolhardy, macho, right? All right. Again, mechanical. Again, thoughtless. Pursuing risk for its own sake. Pursuing risk for small gains. It wasn't a child. It was 25 cents. And he rushed into the house that was on fire. For what? Did he care about the 25 cents, or was he showing off? All right. In the middle, there's an appropriate, actually a range of possible appropriate responses, where you're actually weighing the danger against the gains, the stakes against the risk, and finding the appropriate middle ground. This can only be done by reason. It's very circumstantial. There are no mechanical rules to describe it. There are no reflexes that will give it to you. It can only be done by thinking. If you put reason in charge and you develop a character that makes you, watch this now. This is tricky. Suppose in your upbringing you get some practice in dealing with risk, and you develop a habit of using the appropriate judgment the right sort of way all the time, or reliably at least, barely thinking about it, in a spontaneous kind of way, so that when they stick that microphone up your nose at the end on News 4 or News 5, and they say, "What did you think when you were running into the house to save the little baby?" And they say, they always say the same thing when they do it, don't they? "I didn't think about it at all. I just did it." Right? Why? Because that's the person who has inculcated a habit of acting appropriately in a certain kind of circumstance, and it's become spontaneous. Habit, according to Aristotle, one of his famous remarks, so famous that it's never attributed, habit is second nature. Second nature, you see. All right? Somebody who does it just mechanically, that would be his nature. But somebody who does it thoughtfully, and then spontaneously does it thoughtfully because he's inured himself in that kind of disposition to behave that way, not just behave then, but act. That's habit. That's part of his character. That's the guy you want next to you in the foxhole. Well, Maimonides is assuming that kind of analysis of the idea of virtue and a comparable analysis of the idea of vice. The person who habitually behaves in the wrong ways, he's off to one extreme or the other. And he's habitually not using judgment, habitually not guided by reason. We can now understand how there would be illnesses in our moral capabilities and wellnesses in our moral capabilities, and how these things could be taught to one's children by getting them, as Aristotle says, to do the right thing for the wrong reason at first. You know, you reward them, you give them sweets, you give them praise. Children love praise, they like recognition. And eventually these things get internalized. And if what gets internalized is good judgment, and that becomes a matter of habit, then they've got virtue in that respect. And they can grow and develop and be reliable and be role models to others. Suppose we ask ourselves how you would treat the illnesses of the soul. Maimonides offers a very simple kind of prescription for that. He says, well, suppose you have a patient, if you're a soul doctor, and your patient comes to you with a tendency to be stingy. What do? You take him shopping, and you get that person used to spending money. They get into the habit. They get to enjoy it, because you can tell the difference between virtue and vice by what people enjoy. And this is again based on Aristotle. Aristotle says it isn't that pleasure and pain are good and bad. You can tell who's a good or bad person by what they take pleasure in and what they find painful. A virtuous person enjoys being generous or courageous or thoughtful, and a vicious person finds it painful because he's never developed the right kind of habit. Well, you've got to get that person to sort of break through, and in doing that, you're going to push them a little beyond the mean. It would be like straightening out a spring, that's gone a little too far. You push it back a little the other way, and then you get it to where it ought to be. That's it's a somewhat simple account, and it's only going to work within certain tolerances, but it probably is going to work in a lot of sort of situations with normal people who are seeking that kind of help, I would imagine. Not somebody who's resistant to it. Forcing somebody who is stingy to spend a lot of money is probably not going to help, but forcing somebody who wants to overcome that tendency, that might do it. That's the sort of thing that he has in mind. The reason he brings this up altogether is because of a worry that he has, which is not about people who are habitually stingy, but about people who overdo the compensation. There are people, very common in the Middle Ages, who think that asceticism is good in itself. Remember what asceticism is. Asceticism is the practice of denying the senses or mortifying the flesh. In the extreme form, flagellating yourself, wearing a hair shirt, engaging in celibacy, becoming a hermit and not having anything to do with other people. And I told you right at the beginning of the course, Maimonides, like Sadja, opposes that kind of thing. He says, simple-minded people who see saintly people doing things like that think that they ought to imitate them, and they go overboard, and what they're really doing is taking medicine when they don't need it. The reason saintly people do it is because they're very worried about living in a corrupt society, and they say, like the prophet says, I wish I could go off by myself and just live in a little hut in the woods. By the way, that prophet didn't do it. He lived in the city. But it's always city people who want to go off and live in the woods. People who actually live in the woods would rather live in the city. But that's the that's the objective that they have. They want to be by themselves and think their own thoughts. And then these simple-minded folk see them out there and see that they're holy and good people, and they start imitating them. And they get on the hair shirt and they start cutting their wrists and doing the things that they do, fasting, waking themselves up in the middle of the night. And Maimonides' basic answer to all of that stuff is you've got the basic medicine right in the Torah. It tells you when you should fast and when you should not, and it tells you not to deviate from these laws. Not to the right and not to the left. If you're overdoing it, you're just as much violating the Torah as somebody who doesn't do it at all. All right? It's like the person who thinks that if a little medicine is good, a lot's going to be a lot better. It's that stupid. And there he's using his authority as a physician to make his point. He also uses his authority as a jurist because there's a famous remark in the Talmud about the institution of the Nazir. Everybody knows what a Nazir is. A Nazir is somebody who has sworn not to take wine, not to cut his hair. The most famous Nazir is Samson. Right? Samson was a Nazir. His mother promised from before he was born that razor would never come on his head, he would never drink wine, he would be dedicated to God. There's an interesting law about the Nazir in the Bible. The Nazir generally takes his vow for a stated period of time. He undergoes this ascetic purification for a stated period of time, and when he's done, the Torah says what? Anybody know? I mentioned it once before in the class. Huh? No, he doesn't shave his head. He offers a sacrifice. a typical biblical way of punctuating a ritual act. He offers a sacrifice. The interesting thing is the type of sacrifice. You remember? The rabbi's not allowed to answer. It's a sin offering. And so the Talmud comments, why does the Nazir, after he's completed his vow, offer a sin offering? And what do the rabbis say in the Talmud? Because of the sin he committed against his own soul. He has offended against his desires. He's gone overboard, perhaps for good reason. But he has to acknowledge, in a way, he was wronging himself. Okay? And what you're doing there is you're trying to calibrate this whole business of character. You're trying to adjust the regimen, the discipline that you would apply to yourself, right? The same as you would if you had exercised too much and you had to cool down at the end, or take a shower or something. Maimonides argues that our aim should be one single aim towards which all of our actions should be directed, and by which all of our characteristics can be judged. You can tell whether something is a virtue or a vice, or whether an activity is constructive or not, by how it contributes to this single aim. And the single aim that we all have to pursue is to become like God. We have to get as close to God as possible. We have to know God as well as possible. We have to become as like God as possible. And in Maimonides' parlance, that all means the same thing. Knowing God, becoming like God. And how do you do that? I mean, we studied in our second session together the famous negative theology of Maimonides, where he argues that any positive thing that you could say about God is going to be limited by your own human inadequacies and by the inadequacies of language. He thinks God is utterly transcendent. So what the heck does it mean to say that we have to become like God? This is not a question that comes out of Maimonides' own thinking. It's a question that comes out of the Torah itself, because the Torah says, as I mentioned earlier, you shall be holy, for I, the Lord thy God, am holy. And if you translate the biblical language, the word holy is used in the Torah to indicate God's transcendence, which in relative and negative terms means how utterly unlike us God is. So what does it mean to say that we're supposed to emulate God's holiness? Are we supposed to become unlike ourselves because God is unlike ourselves? The idea is, where all that negative theology points is toward the idea of God as an absolutely perfect being. Now, we're not going to be absolutely perfect beings, but we're going to be perfect as humans. That's why the psychology is so relevant, you see, because if you know what it is to be a human, and you know what the human strengths and weaknesses are, that will tell you how to be a better human, how to be a more perfect human, and the two will feed into one another. You become like God when you become a better human. The more perfect you are as a human being, the better you will understand God. The more you contemplate God's act in creation, and the more you understand God's wisdom and justice and mercy in the way that God governs creation, the closer you will be to God. Because after all, the object of your knowledge is the content of your mind. You become what you know. You know how they used to say back in the 70s, you are what you eat. Maimonides doesn't think you are what you eat because you assimilate what you eat. But you are what you know. So if you understand God through creation, not quite as well as Moses did, perhaps, who had this vision and understood nature comprehensively and saw God's presence and God's governance throughout nature, but in your own way, as best as you can. That brings you closer to God, and that makes you more like God. Knowing God as the ruler of creation, knowing God through creation, becoming like God by being more perfect. These are the goals of human life. And every other human activity is well directed if it serves that end, and is misdirected and a waste of time if it doesn't. Now, I mentioned to you earlier, and I'll mention it again because this is the proper place to say it, recreation, that's okay. As the English word recreation actually suggests. You're recreating yourself. People need to laugh. People need beautiful things around them. People need to enjoy life. That's part of a well-balanced and strong character. And remember that the character is the raw material in which the mind will subsist. And the mind is that which will know God. You're going to have that base. You're going to have to, it's a three-stage thing, like a wedding cake. You're going to have the physical basis to survive and be healthy and well, and the moral basis to be an effective human being and interact adequately with your fellow human beings. And then on top of that, you're going to build the spiritual, intellectual basis, which will put you in contact with the divine, which is your ultimate goal. If you live just to stay well and healthy and live a long life, and that's your ultimate goal, that's when you're wasting your time. On the other hand, Maimonides argues, puts in a plug for his own profession here, medicine is very important. Because after all, there are people who never live long enough to perfect themselves morally, to provide the moral base that they would need for their intellectual perfection, and don't attain that kind of fulfillment that would be represented as a kind of, Spinoza would say, intellectual love of God. Others would say a kind of beatific vision. They don't get to that point. A physician, working as a very important means to an end, can help people live that long, just as a good lifestyle can do, just as a good social basis can. So you can see, if you start looking at the laws in the Torah from that point of view, and look at them with Maimonides' assumption that they all serve some purpose, there would be three kinds of purposes that they would serve. To keep you healthy, to regulate society and improve human character, and to, what? Well, you can't really command ideas, but to open up the possibility for the recognition of ideas through symbolism, through story, through ritual. Right? And does the Torah tell us that it's doing that? Certainly it does. The Sabbath, for example, is a symbolic remembrance of the act of creation, which puts you in mind of the reality of God. Okay? So instead of saying, thou shalt believe in God, which never has worked, it tells you to observe the Sabbath and keep it holy. And it tells you that the Sabbath is Zecher, what? The Maaseh Bereshit, is a reminder of the act of creation. Using that very concrete word, Goodman says symbol, but the Torah says a reminder. Okay? Very concrete. He asks a little question. It's a classic question in philosophy. Which is better? To do what's right because you really ought to do it and it's your duty even if you don't like to, or to do it in the spontaneous and natural kind of way where you're happy to do it and you barely think about it. And the problem is, there are good philosophical arguments on both sides of that split, and there are good textual arguments too. On the idea of duty, even if you don't like it, there's a rabbinic remark that the reward is proportioned to the difficulty. All right? The harder it is, the more worthy it is. And on the other side, it's obvious that a person who hates to do the right thing is not a very good person. And we have all that Aristotelian line of argument about that, right? That the good person is the one who enjoys doing the right thing. And Maimonides says this. He says, you can reconcile those two different points of view if you recognize that they're talking about two different situations. Because we have two different kinds of laws in the Torah. There are laws which the sages, that means the rabbis in the Talmud, describe as the ones that if God hadn't said them, we would have had to make them up ourselves. Like thou shalt not murder. Thou shalt not steal. Right? A person who really, has it deeply ingrained in him that he'd rather murder is not a very good person, and it's really worse. Right? It's really better to have a live and let live attitude, and to be well, not just that one, but to be a happy person, to be a friendly person, all of those things, all of the things that are the traditional moral vices, moral virtues. All right? Those are the good characteristics to have. But there are other laws that the rabbis describe as the ones that the nations cavil at and criticize and say, why do they have a law like that? And he mentions, for example, shotness. Shotness is the prohibition against wearing linen and wool in the same garment. Not something we would have had to invent if it hadn't been commanded by God. Not something we would ever even have thought of by ourselves. And the traditional distinction, is that the ones that we would have had to invent ourselves, they're traditionally called mishpatim. Those are called ordinances. And the ones that we never would have thought of and that people criticize, those are called hukim, statutes. And it's traditional to say, you've heard it said many times, that the statutes don't have any reasons. Or, more accurately, we don't know the reasons for them. Maimonides has an interesting remark to say about that. He says, some of our Jewish writers, infected by the kalam, call the ordinances rational commandments, as if to say that the rest weren't. All right? He doesn't think that any of the commandments have no reasons. And we'll talk about that in another session. But he says, those where it's not directly related to a desirable strength of character, those are the ones where that creaturely sense of duty, that sense of obligation, if somebody offers you a plate full of crab meat, what are you supposed to say according to the Talmud? Yeah, sure, you're supposed to say no thanks, but it's interesting you're supposed to say thanks. You see, you're supposed to say, this is Talmud, I didn't make this up. You're supposed to say, it looks delicious, but my Father in heaven wouldn't allow me to eat that. There's nothing wrong with it. It's not that it's bad. It's not like killing somebody or stealing something or lying. It's not intrinsically bad. But it's a way of expressing devotion to God. It's a way of expressing a symbolic attachment to giving thanks to God, that we restrict ourselves in those various ways. All right? So here you can see the thing resolved, right? The things that it's fine to desire them, right? And overcoming that desire isn't a kind of merit. Whereas the other things, the ones that would amount to vices, it's not fine to desire. I've got time for about, 2 more points. Chapters 7 and 8 of the 8 chapters. How's that for about 5 minutes remaining? Chapter 7 is about the barrier. There's a barrier between, he says that our goal in life is to know God. And there's a barrier between us and God. And he gets his idea of what that barrier is. Well, he finds a proof text for his idea of what that barrier is in a remark that Isaiah makes. Is Isaiah? I think it's Jeremiah. No, it's Isaiah. 59:2. For your let me give it to you right. For your iniquities are what have divided you from your God. He gets the idea there that moral weaknesses create a barrier between us and our ultimate goal, which is this becoming more like God and knowing God and perfecting ourselves and so forth. Moral weaknesses make that difficult. Moral weaknesses carried too far make it impossible. And he gives examples about that, situations where one of the prophets would be angry and for that period of time he couldn't prophesy. Or why is someone like Solomon, who had revelations from God and is therefore a prophet, but why is he such a lesser prophet? Venery. He had a vice. He had a weakness. David, ruthless. It prevented David from realizing his full potential because he had venery was one, but ruthlessness was a more prominent one in David. And he makes a very interesting remark about Moses in this regard. Because Moses, was not allowed to enter the promised land. Why? Well, God told Moses when the people were thirsty that he should strike the rock. That he should speak to the rock. But he struck it instead. And traditionally you'll see this referred to, especially in Christian sources, as lack of faith. He didn't do exactly what God told him, he lacked faith. That is not Maimonides' interpretation of what happened. Because what did Moses say when he struck the rock? He hollered at the people. He said, "Listen, rebels." And Maimonides, who has a very strong democratic streak for an elitist, says, this was a people the least handmaiden of which was on a par with the prophet Ezekiel. He takes that from Mechilta, by the way. He didn't make that up. The least handmaiden was on a par with the prophet Ezekiel. She had a vision of God as good as Ezekiel had, which is a relatively low level for a prophet, but pretty good for a handmaiden. All right. And Moses yelled at them. And they believed that he was such a paragon that whatever he did they felt terrible. He called them rebels because they were thirsty and tired. What happened? He lost his temper. Don't we all lose our temper? Happens. But remember, not only was Moses supposed to be exemplary and therefore held to a very high standard, but it means that he had allowed his character to slip to the point where he could lose his temper that way. It wasn't just the one-time thing. There was a weakness in him. There was a flaw. And this, for a moment, separates him from God. It denies him vision. I've got time for one last point, I think. Are we okay?
One last point.
One last point. Okay. This is the point about Pharaoh, and I'll make it quick. It's all spelled out in the 8th of the 8 chapters. The famous conundrum about Pharaoh. And it has to do with that issue of determinism. We can discuss it more when we come back from davening. It says right at the beginning when Moses is getting his charge that God is going to harden Pharaoh's heart. And that Pharaoh's going to be asked to let the Israelites go, and he's not going to do it because God's going to harden his heart. The question is this: why the plagues? Why the drowning in the Red Sea? Why all these consequences if God was the one who hardened Pharaoh's heart? Doesn't that contradict the whole idea that we should be responsible for our own actions? And here, God was pulling the strings, Pharaoh was the marionette, and yet Pharaoh gets punished. That's the final question that Maimonides deals with in the 8 chapters because he's dealing with the issue of personal responsibility. And what he says is this. For you philosophers, this has Stoic roots via the Mutazilites. I can spell that out for you another time. Pharaoh, he says, if God had been pulling the strings entirely, then the objection would be entirely sound. But that wasn't the original fault in Pharaoh. The original wrongdoing that Pharaoh did was when they had their council and they said, these Israelites scattered through the land, foreign people, what if they get added to our enemies if there's a war? Let's deal wisely with them. Let's have a policy here. And that was when the policy of genocide, killing the males, saving the females, was instituted. That was not done under pressure. That was not manipulated. What happens? What happens whenever there's a policy, personal or political? Things get a momentum. Pharaoh gets committed to what he's doing. First because he thinks it's wise, then because he thinks it's clever, but ultimately because it's what he's already been doing. And he's more and more committed to it, and the more committed he is to it, the more committed he stays to it. And he digs himself into a rut. What's happening is that the consequence of Pharaoh's choice is to commit him further and further to that line of action. The consequence of his choice is the narrowing of his degrees of freedom and the impossibility of extricating himself from the further consequences of that choice. Natural consequences, according to Maimonides, are always called divine actions in the Bible. Okay? So when God says he'll harden Pharaoh's heart, he's talking about the natural tendency of human psychology and of political psychology to commit ourselves deeper and deeper to what we've been doing. Very, very hard to extricate yourself. Not impossible. As the story of Jonah indicates, or in our own lifetimes, the things that happened in South Africa. Right? Not impossible, but increasingly difficult. The consequence of your choices could be to broaden your degrees of freedom or to narrow them. And that's what it means when it says that God will harden Pharaoh's heart. Yet the choice, the initial choice, for which Pharaoh bore the consequences, was his own, freely made. Okay, I'm going to stop there.